All the way through our Lenten Sunday Gospel readings, we've heard how Jesus has transformed the suffering of people he encountered by healing them. You remember them. There was the crippled man at the pool, the blind man, Lazarus, whose sickness and death overwhelmed his sisters with grief, and the Samaritan woman who struggled with emotional and spiritual turmoil. They represent the diversity of human suffering, from physical sickness and disability to grief to emotional and spiritual anguish. Not only does Jesus heal their suffering, but he gives them new life in ways that they would never have dreamed of. Now, it's Jesus who is suffering, and suffering unimaginably. It's almost as if the suffering of all the people that Jesus has healed throughout his ministry has been bundled together and given to Jesus to bear, and then some additional sufferings thrown in for good measure. Jesus suffers on every level possible. Think about it for a moment. He's been betrayed by his friends. His closest counselors and supporters have abandoned him. He's in physical agony because of the scourging and the crucifixion, and he's been ridiculed and humiliated by those who persecute him. And then finally, there's the anguish of seeing his mother and his friends standing there suffering beside themselves with grief as they watch him suffer, unable to do anything. But here's the clincher. The man that saved everybody else doesn't save himself. No wonder that most of his disciples and his followers are overwhelmed with disappointment and disillusionment, so much so that they just slip away to hide behind closed doors. From their vantage point, this isn't at all the way it was supposed to end, in degradation and humiliation, in rejection, in betrayal. In the eyes of Jesus' disciples, everything that could have gone wrong went wrong, and the worst imaginable thing has happened. 20 years ago this month, everything that could have gone wrong went wrong, and the worst imaginable things happened in a country which at that time most Americans had barely even heard of, barely even knew existed. And that country was, of course, Rwanda, which has since become a byword for genocide. In April 1994, a world which had witnessed some of the most unspeakable atrocities in human history during the 20th century gave a collective gasp of horror at the scale of the Rwandan genocide. Over 1 million Tutsis and moderate Hutus were massacred in the space of 3 short months in an unspeakable orgy of killing led by machete and gun-wielding gangs of Hutus. In all of that apocalyptic darkness, there were bright lights of bravery and heroism and self-sacrifice and faith. One of those bright lights was a young Tutsi woman, a devout Catholic, a college student at the time, Immaculée Ilibagiza. And she tells the story of her experiences of the Rwandan genocide in a book she entitled Left to Tell, Discovering God Amidst the Rwandan Holocaust. In this book, she describes how she spent those 3 months hidden in a tiny bathroom with 7 other women and children in the house of a sympathetic Hutu pastor. The space was so small, 3 feet by 4 feet, and if you think about if you're sitting with a person on either side of you, that might be a little more than 3 feet, and if you look to the pew behind you, that might be stretching back to the next pew, that might be a little more than 4 feet. In order to fit into this terribly tiny space, these 8 people had to sit and lie on top of each other. Throughout the 3 months, they were close to starving because they could only drink or eat what the pastor was able to smuggle into them and pass under the doorway. They couldn't bathe at all, and so they were covered in lice. And they had to keep absolutely silent and still so as not to be discovered by anybody else in the household. Nobody else knew they were there. I'm sure most of you have read The Diary of Anne Frank. To be absolutely honest with you, their conditions of confinement make Anne's hiding place look like a resort hotel. Imagine what it must have been like for them, hearing the sounds of slaughter and fearing that they could be found or betrayed at any moment during that whole time. On one dreadful occasion, they heard the sound of a woman being hacked to death outside the bathroom window. They knew she had a baby with her because they could hear the baby crying. After the mother died, they could still hear the baby crying and crying and crying for many hours into the night until the crying weakened and then finally stopped. The unimaginable happened in Rwanda. Immaculée describes how she was able to survive this time, spiritually as well as physically, because of her faith and trust in God, and because of her knowledge that Jesus was with her every step of the way. She knew that Jesus understood the suffering that she was experiencing. At the beginning of her confinement, she's immersed in prayer, and she realizes that she can't pray the Our Father with authenticity because she can't find a way to pray for forgiveness for her enemies. Hardly surprisingly, she has a very difficult time trying to pray for the forgiveness of the people that have killed her parents, two of her brothers, her numerous extended family, and too many of her friends to count. And she finds it hard to pray for people who would rape her and kill her if they could find her, and they're looking for her. But she prays for the ability to forgive them. And little by little, she's able to find the grace to pray for those who are responsible for the genocide. Even in the most hellish conditions of her confinement, Immaculée's experience of suffering and grief is transformed by her faith in the power of Jesus Christ. She writes, "In the midst of the genocide, I had found my salvation. I knew that my bond with God would transcend the bathroom, the war, and the Holocaust. It was a bond I now knew would transcend life itself." Everything that could have gone wrong went wrong for Jesus. And the worst imaginable thing happened to him. But his death on the cross was not the end of the story, contrary to what the disciples thought. Jesus' death on the cross didn't end suffering. If that had been his goal, then he could have overcome his captors, he could have magically freed himself, or he could have made himself impenetrable to suffering like a superhero. No, his death didn't end suffering. Instead, by embracing his own suffering and death, Jesus transformed the darkness, sin, pain, and tragedy of the crucifixion into something else, the everlasting life, light, joy, and hope of the resurrection. Immaculée experienced that life-giving transformation, the redemptive nature of the cross, even in the midst of her own incomprehensible suffering in the midst of that Rwandan Holocaust 20 years ago. By taking up the cross, by accepting all that came with it, Christ walks with us now in solidarity with our own pain, whatever that pain might be, so that we too can overcome the darkness to find light, so that we can transcend death to find new life. Christ knows our sorrows, and he knows our anguish. In the reading from the letter to the Hebrews we heard earlier, these words resonate. "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weakness, but one who has similarly been tested in every way." The end of the story, as it turns out, is only the beginning. The crucifixion leads to the resurrection. at the end of Immaculate's story of what happened to her in that terrible Rwandan genocide, she returns to the village to confront the man who had murdered her mother and one of her brothers. When the man, Felicien, is brought as a prisoner to the room where she's waiting, she's shocked at his emaciated and filthy appearance. And I'm going to read you just her description of that encounter. I wept at the sight of his suffering. Felicien had let the devil enter his heart, and the evil had ruined his life like a cancer in his soul. I was overwhelmed with pity for the man. Felicien was sobbing. I could feel his shame. He looked up at me for only a moment, but our eyes met. I reached out, touched his hands lightly, and quietly said what I had come to say. I forgive you. My heart eased immediately, and I saw the tension release in Felicien's shoulders before Samana, the magistrate, pushed him out of the door and into the courtyard. 2 soldiers yanked Felicien up by his armpits and dragged him back toward his cell. When Samana returned, he was furious. What was that all about, Immaculée? That was the man who murdered your family. I brought him to you to question, to spit on if you wanted to. But you forgave him. How could you do that? Why did you forgive him? I answered him with the truth. Forgiveness is all I have to offer. And that, my brothers and sisters, is the enduring and the redemptive power of Jesus Christ, who suffered and died for us on a cross 2,000 years ago.